Supreme Court justices are set for rare public events in the final weeks of the court's summer recess. Justice Amy Coney Barrett is already making headlines with leaked excerpts from her forthcoming book speaking about her role in overturning Roe v. Wade, which 3 years ago ended the constitutional right to an abortion. Joining us to discuss, Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter here at The Hill. He is co-author of the Gavel newsletter. Get it in your inbox. So, Zach, Barrett was obviously key to this overturning of Roe v. Wade. It was a 5-4 decision. She's now speaking publicly about that, at least through her book, these excerpts that have been leaked. What's she saying?
Hey, Drew, that's right. We are now getting the first excerpts from Justice Amy Coney Barrett's forthcoming book, which is set to be published next week. This excerpt was published in a report by CNN. I'll just read you a little bit from it, because this is actually really the most that we've ever heard from Justice Amy Coney Barrett about that decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. She, of course, joined that majority opinion that overturned constitutional abortion protections, but she was not the author of that opinion. Instead, was authored by Justice Samuel Alito. She didn't write separately in that opinion. So this is really the first time that we're actually hearing Justice Barrett's voice talking about the decision. So I'll just read you a little bit from this excerpt published by CNN. She said that Roe versus Wade was, quote, getting ahead of the American people. She goes on to write that, quote, the court's role is to respect the choices that people have agreed upon, not to tell them what they should agree to. So certainly here, a full-throated endorsement of that Dobbs decision and that majority opinion that was authored by Justice Samuel Alito. Now, this is just the first excerpt from this forthcoming book. It's called Listening to the Law. And at least the way that her publisher has been billing this forthcoming book is they've been saying that it's going to give readers a look at Justice Barrett's deliberation process and also her dealings of media scrutiny. Of course, the Dobbs decision has been one of the most significant decisions that we've seen from this conservative majority, but now the question becomes, what else is she going to have to say as this book gets ready to become released?
And it's not just media scrutiny. She's also become kind of a target of the right, especially kind of the online MAGA right. She's kind of a swing vote on this new conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Do we expect to hear about that in the book and maybe in some of these public appearances?
Well, at least in the book itself, at this point it's been headed to print. So in terms of some of these recent decisions involving the Trump administration, not sure we're necessarily going to hear her talk about any of those specific cases. But as you mentioned, she's also doing this blitz of public appearances, which is, we occasionally will see a justice speak at a judicial conference or maybe a civics event, accepting an award, things like that. But now Justice Amy Coney Barrett, as she goes out and promotes her book, she is set to really do a coast-to-coast book tours, everything from presidential libraries to universities and everything in between. So one of the key questions heading into this book release is not only what is in the book, but also what is she going to say as she sits down for these various Q&A sessions across the country.
And Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor also have books to promote. They also have public events this month. They've frequently been in the minority in some of the most controversial decisions of the new conservative majority, especially during the second Trump term. What are you watching for as they make these public appearances?
I think right now, Justices Jackson and Sotomayor, in terms of where they are at with their books and these tours, it's a little bit of a different posture. So I'll take them one by one, starting with Justice Jackson, who, of course, is the most junior justice on the court. She was President Biden's appointee to the court. She actually now is getting ready to start year 2 of her book tour. It's been quite a marathon book tour. She released this memoir, lovely one. It came out last year, but she is still speaking to audiences all across the country and even internationally about this book. Now, at times, we've seen Justice Jackson not be afraid to speak out, even if she hasn't been mentioning Trump by name. We've seen her talk a lot at these public appearances about the importance of the rule of law. So even though not really mentioning the president, as you listen to her remarks, I don't think it's too much, leaving too much doubt as to who she is referring to. So she is continuing that, but we've seen her making a lot of public appearances. But Justice Sotomayor, on the other hand, who is the most senior liberal justice appointed by President Obama, this is a new book tour. She is getting ready to release a children's picture book that's set to come out next week. Now, because this is a children's book, she's talking, for example, at various libraries and things like that. So I'd expect that she's going to spend a lot of her time really talking to kids in the audience and maybe not necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of the Supreme Court's work. But of course, we'll be watching to see what she has to say about what's going on right now at the court.
You mentioned that justices don't usually speak out in forums like this where there's like a true Q&A and perhaps some wild card questions could come up. Do you think there's a reason why justices now are kind of more willing to put themselves out there like this?
Well, we've seen as, the Supreme Court justices, and not just these three, but other Supreme Court justices in the past, it really are these book releases oftentimes when we hear the most from them in public. Obviously, the justices speak out in their opinions, they speak out at oral arguments, but in terms of these actual public appearances that aren't directly over the cases before them, it is quite rare for them to be making public appearances, and specifically so many public appearances. Now, I should also note that these book deals have become a major source of income for many of these justices. Justice Barrett, for example, her book advance is reportedly worth $2 million. So we've seen several of these justices, oftentimes, their book earnings have actually eclipsed their taxpayer salaries that they get for being a Supreme Court justice. So obviously, these book tours, they want to sell lots of copies, they want to sell these books, but at the same time, it really, is these book releases that ends up being the time when we get to hear a lot from them.
Now, this comes as the Trump administration continues to push the bounds of its legal authority. The Supreme Court will be busy this fall hearing challenges to Trump's actions. What do you think are the most important cases that we should be watching when the Supreme Court returns this fall?
Well, one case that we'll be watching very closely as the Supreme Court gets into this next term, which begins in October, is we'll be watching a big redistricting case that comes out of Louisiana. But this case doesn't only pose major implications for the future of Louisiana's congressional map, it also poses implications for redistricting really all across the country, because the justices here could take a key axe to what is left of the Voting Rights Act, a key provision of that landmark Voting Rights Act law, Section 2, which plaintiffs have used all across the country, specifically, especially in the South, to force Republican-led states to have to redraw their congressional maps and other voting maps over accusations that they are packing and cracking racial minorities into specific districts. But really, this case in Louisiana has nationwide implications. So that'll be a big one. That's on their normal docket. And then what we're also watching for is, of course, the president is now signaling that he will also be bringing the tariff case to the Supreme Court. So that appeal hasn't been filed quite yet, but we're watching for it because the president said yesterday in the Oval Office that it could land as soon as today.
All right, lots to watch for this fall. For now, we'll leave it at that. Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter here at The Hill. In order to get his newsletter sent right to your inbox, head over to thehill.com, click on newsletters, click down to the gavel, and you'll have all his insights right in your inbox. Zach Schoenfeld, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Drew.